The last thing I remember before the world turned into screeching metal and white light was the smell of my sister's perfume still clinging to my jacket, because I'd hugged her goodbye an hour earlier at her engagement party, and I remember thinking, right before the truck ran the red light and turned my Honda Civic into scrap, that I needed to get that perfume smell out of my car because it was giving me a headache. That's it. That's the last normal thought I ever had. A headache from perfume, then glass, then silence, then nothing. My name is Amanda Whitfield. I'm 26 years old, and I work as a pediatric physical therapist at a children's rehabilitation center outside of Columbus, Ohio. I help kids who've had strokes, kids born with cerebral palsy, and kids recovering from surgeries that no 8-year-old should ever have to go through, learn how to use their bodies again. I chose that job because I like fixing things that feel unfixable. I like sitting on the floor with a 4-year-old who can't grip a spoon and celebrating like we won the lottery when he finally can. It is not glamorous work. It does not pay especially well. But it is, without exaggeration, the thing I am proudest of in my entire life. And I want you to understand something about me before I tell you the rest of this, because it matters. I am not a dramatic person. I don't start fights. I don't need to be the center of attention. If anything, my personality has always run toward the background. I'm the one refilling the drinks at the party, not the one making the toast. My mother used to call me low maintenance, and for most of my life I wore that like a badge of honor, because in my family, low maintenance was the only role available to me. See, I have a younger sister. Her name is Tiffany. She's 23, and if you'd met our family at any point over the last 2 decades, you would have known within about 4 minutes that Tiffany was the sun, and the rest of us were just orbiting her, grateful for the light. I don't say that with bitterness. I'm saying it because it's just true. And it was true for so long that by the time I was old enough to really notice it, I'd already built my entire personality around not needing anything, because there simply wasn't room. My parents are Robert and Carol Whitfield. My dad's 58, worked 30 years as a regional manager for an insurance company, the kind of steady, unremarkable career that pays the mortgage and not much else. My mom's 56, was a stay-at-home mom my whole childhood, and if I'm being honest, being a stay-at-home mom to Tiffany was basically a full-time emotional support job. Tiffany was diagnosed with pretty severe anxiety when she was 12, and I want to be clear, that's real. Anxiety is real. I've never once doubted that my sister struggles with something genuine, but somewhere along the way, in a house with 2 daughters and one crisis that got all the oxygen, my sister's anxiety became the organizing principle of our entire household. And I became the daughter who didn't require organizing around. If Tiffany had a bad day, dinner revolved around her. If Tiffany couldn't sleep, my mother sat outside her door until 2 a.m. If Tiffany failed a class, there were family meetings, tutors, a rotation of specialists. If I failed a class, which, for the record, happened exactly once, 9th grade algebra, because I was quietly struggling and nobody noticed, I got a post-it note on my door that said, "We know you can do better. Love, Mom." And that was the entire intervention. I'm not telling you this to make you feel sorry for me. I promise you, that's not where this story is going. I'm telling you because you need to understand the architecture of my family before I tell you what happened on the night of March 14th. Because without that architecture, none of it makes any sense. Without it, you'd hear what my parents did and think, that's not possible. No parent would do that. But if you'd grown up in my house, you'd have understood immediately. You'd have seen it coming from a mile away, the way I somehow, stupidly, did not. The night of the accident was actually a good night, before it wasn't. Tiffany had just gotten engaged to her boyfriend Brandon, a genuinely sweet guy who sold cars at a Toyota dealership, and who I liked far more than I probably should have liked anyone dating my sister, given the dynamic I just described. The engagement party was at my parents' house, string lights in the backyard, my mom's famous lemon bars, the whole thing. I gave a toast. I hugged my sister and told her I was happy for her, and I meant it, because whatever complicated feelings I had about our family, I never once wished Tiffany ill. That's important. Hold on to that. I left around 9:30 because I had an early shift the next morning, working with a 6-year-old named Mason who just had his second hip surgery, and who I did not want to disappoint by showing up exhausted. I remember waving to my dad from the driveway, I remember my mom yelling that there were extra lemon bars in a container on the passenger seat if I wanted them. Small, ordinary, forgettable moments, except that they weren't forgettable, because they were the last normal moments of my old life. 12 minutes later, at the intersection of Route 9 and Maple, a 19-year-old kid in a pickup truck ran a red light doing 55 miles an hour and hit my driver's side door dead on. I don't remember the impact. I've been told by the paramedics who filed the report and later by a detective who came to interview me for the accident record that my car was pushed almost 30 feet, that the door had to be cut off with the jaws of life, that I was unconscious and not breathing on my own by the time they got me out. I had a traumatic brain injury, a collapsed lung, a shattered pelvis, and internal bleeding that the ER doctors would later say came within what they described as a very narrow window of killing me before they even got me into surgery. I was rushed to Mercy General, and somewhere in the chaos of the trauma bay, a nurse pulled my emergency contact information off my phone, which had survived the crash in my jacket pocket, and called my parents. I know what was said in that first call because I got the full story much later, from someone who was standing in the room. I know that a woman named Nurse Patricia identified herself, explained there had been a serious car accident, and said the words, "Your daughter is in critical condition and we need you to come to the hospital immediately." And I know that my mother's response, and I want you to sit with this, because I certainly have, was, "We're a little busy right now. Her sister's having a really hard night. Is there someone else we can call?" Patricia, understandably confused, clarified that this was Amanda, that Amanda was unconscious, that Amanda had just come out of emergency surgery, and the situation was extremely serious. And my mother said, and this is the part that even now, even after everything that's happened since, still knocks the air out of me every single time I say it out loud. "Can you just keep us updated? We really can't leave right now. Tiffany's having a panic attack about the wedding date and we don't want to leave her alone." Tiffany, by the way, was not having a medical emergency. There was no ambulance involved. There was, as I would learn later, a disagreement between Tiffany and Brandon over whether to have the wedding in June or September, which had triggered one of my sister's anxiety spirals. The kind our family had spent 2 decades treating as equivalent to a 5-alarm fire. My parents chose that. They chose a scheduling argument over their daughter lying unconscious in a hospital bed with a brain injury. And I know exactly what you're thinking right now, because I thought it too, over and over in the weeks that followed. You're thinking, surely once they understood how serious it was, they came. Surely nobody is that far gone. Surely there's a version of this where they walked through those hospital doors within the hour, terrified, sorry human. They did not come that night. They did not come the next day. My condition worsened over the following 48 hours. The swelling in my brain increased. I had to be placed in a medically induced coma to give my body a chance to stabilize. And at one point, a doctor named Dr. Sandra Reyes, who I would come to think of as one of the great quiet heroes of my life, called my parents personally and said the words that should have ended any hesitation on earth. "I need you to understand that tonight might be the night we lose her. If you want to see your daughter, you need to come now." My mother's response to that call, and again, I heard this secondhand, but from someone with absolutely no reason to lie to me, was that she started crying, said this was too much, said Tiffany needed her more because Tiffany doesn't have the coping skills for something like this, and hung up saying they'd try to come when things calmed down. They did not come. Now, here's where I need to introduce you to the person who actually was there, because if this story had no one like him in it, I don't think I'd be able to tell it to you at all without it breaking something in me permanently. His name is Marcus Delgado. He's 29, and at the time of the accident, he was a physical therapist at the same rehab center where I worked, though he specialized in adult stroke recovery on a different floor. We weren't dating. I want to be really clear about that because this isn't a story about a secret romance that saves the day. Even though, yes, fine, we are together now, and yes, I'll get to that. But at the time, Marcus was simply my closest friend at work, the guy I ate lunch with most days, the guy who could always tell when I was having a rough week, even though I never said anything. Because I've never been good at saying when I'm struggling old habits, you understand? Marcus found out about the accident because I hadn't shown up for my shift with Mason, which was so unlike me that the front desk called my emergency contact. My mother got no real answer, and eventually someone thought to call the hospitals. Marcus heard about it from our supervisor and drove to Mercy General straight from work, still in his scrubs. He told me later that when he got there and asked the nurse's station about my family, Patricia, the same nurse who'd made that first call, looked at him with this expression he said he'd never forget, somewhere between exhausted and furious, and said, "Are you family? Because so far the only person who's shown up is you." Marcus stayed. I need you to understand what that actually means because stayed doesn't quite capture it. He took vacation days he'd been saving for 2 years. He slept in a hospital chair for the first 4 nights. He held my hand during the hours I was in the coma, even though I couldn't feel it, even though there was no guarantee I'd ever know. He talked to my doctors, asked the questions I would have wanted asked, made sure I had someone tracking every medication, every vital sign, every small shift in my condition. When Dr. Reyes needed someone to sign off on a secondary procedure because my actual family couldn't be reached, it was Marcus who sat with the hospital's ethics liaison for 2 hours, establishing that he was my designated emergency proxy on file at work, something I'd set up years earlier for workplace injury purposes and never thought I'd actually need, so that decisions about my care didn't stall out waiting for parents who weren't coming. I woke up on day 6, groggy, disoriented, my mouth like sandpaper, tubes I didn't understand running into my arms. And the first face I saw, leaning forward in a chair that had clearly become the shape of his body over the past week, unshaven, exhausted, was Marcus. He told me later that the first thing I said, barely audible, was, "You look terrible." He said it was the best thing he'd heard all week because it meant I was still me. I asked where my parents were. I remember that clearly, even through the fog. And I remember the way Marcus's face did something complicated, something he was trying to smooth over before I could read it, and he said gently, "They know you're here. They've been dealing with some stuff with Tiffany. I'm sure they'll come soon." I believed him. Of course I believed him. Even after everything I've told you, some part of me, some stubborn, hopeful, 26-year-old part of me, still believed that there was no version of reality where my parents knew I'd almost died and simply didn't come. I want to tell you about the week that followed, because it matters, and because I think it's the part of the story that people find hardest to believe, harder even than what came after. I was moved out of the ICU on day 7, once I was stable enough, but because of the severity of my pelvic fracture and the ongoing monitoring my brain injury required, Dr. Reyes made the call to transfer me to a specialized inpatient trauma rehabilitation facility about 40 minutes away called Ridgeview Rehabilitation Center, rather than a standard hospital recovery floor. This is a completely normal thing that happens with injuries like mine. It is not unusual. It is not sinister. It is simply what good medical care looks like for a body that's been through what mine had been through. The problem, and this is the detail that changes everything about how this story unfolds, is that my parents still had not called, had not visited, and had not, as far as anyone could tell, made any effort to find out how I was doing beyond the one text my mother sent Marcus's number, which the hospital had apparently passed along after my mother finally asked, 3 days in, for an update, which read, in its entirety, "Please keep us posted. This is such a hard time for our family." Our family. As if she wasn't part of it. As if the two halves of it, me in a hospital bed and them at home with Tiffany, existed on separate planets. Before I was transferred, still weak, still working through the fog of the coma and the medication, I did something that I now understand, in hindsight, was one of the most important things I've ever done. Though at the time it felt like nothing more than an exhausted, heartbroken instinct. I asked a nurse for a piece of paper. My hands were shaking too badly to write more than a few lines, and I remember Marcus offering to write it for me and me shaking my head, because I needed it to be in my own handwriting, even if it looked like a child's scrawl. I wrote it because some part of me, still not entirely convinced I was going to survive whatever came next, wanted to leave something behind. Not for my parents specifically. I didn't write it to them. I wrote it because Dr. Reyes had gently explained, in the way doctors do when they need you to understand something serious without terrifying you, that my recovery was going to be long, that there were still risks, and that it would be good for me to have my wishes documented in case anything changed. So I wrote a short letter. It said that if anything happened to me, I wanted Marcus Delgado to be the one making decisions about my care, because he was the only person who had actually shown up. It said I wanted my savings, modest as they were, and my apartment, and anything of value I owned, to go to the children's rehabilitation program I worked for, specifically to fund equipment for kids like Mason whose families couldn't afford it. And then, at the bottom, in handwriting that got worse as the note went on because my hand was shaking so badly, I wrote one more line, and I remember writing it. I remember exactly what I was feeling, which was not rage, not yet, just a bone-deep, quiet grief. I wrote, "To whoever reads this, I waited. I don't think anyone's coming." I left it on the hospital tray table when they wheeled me out to transfer me to Ridgeview. I don't fully know why I left it instead of taking it with me. I think honestly, some wounded part of me wanted it to exist in that room. In case anyone ever came looking and found only an empty bed. I had absolutely no idea when I left that note behind what it would do to the people who eventually found it. I had no idea, in fact, that it would become the single most consequential piece of paper of my entire life. My parents finally came to Mercy General 8 days after the accident. I want to walk you through what I understand happened because I've since had it confirmed by 3 separate people: Marcus, Nurse Patricia, and much later, in a deposition that I'll get to, my own mother, under oath, unable to deny any of it. They didn't come because they'd suddenly remembered their eldest daughter existed. They came because Tiffany's anxiety spiral had, over the course of that week, evolved into something my mother described, and I quote, as Tiffany finally realizing how serious this whole thing actually was and insisting we go check on Amanda. My sister, and this is a detail I did not expect, and one that complicates the tidy villain narrative you might be building in your head right now. So hang on to it. Had apparently spent several days assuming, because my parents told her so, that I was banged up but fine and resting. It wasn't until Brandon, her fiancé, who had heard through mutual friends how serious the accident actually was, sat Tiffany down and asked her, point blank, "Wait, why hasn't anyone gone to see her? Is she okay?" That Tiffany realized the truth had been kept from her, and she lost it. Not an anxiety spiral this time. Real, appropriate horror. So a week after the accident, my parents and my sister walked into Mercy General, asked for my room, and were directed to the floor I'd been on. They found the bed empty. Stripped, the way hospital beds get stripped after a patient's been discharged or transferred. No monitors, no machines, nothing. And on the tray table, exactly where I'd left it, was the note. I wasn't there for this moment. I was 40 minutes away at Ridgeview, doing my first excruciating physical therapy session, learning how to sit upright without my vision swimming. But I've had it described to me enough times, by enough different people who witnessed different pieces of the aftermath, that I can tell it to you almost like I watched it myself. My mother read the note first. According to Tiffany, who told me this months later with her voice shaking, my mother's hands started trembling so badly she had to hold the paper against the tray table to keep reading it. My father read over her shoulder, and when they got to that last line, I waited. "I don't think anyone's coming." My mother made a sound Tiffany said she'd never heard come out of a human being before, something between a scream and a sob, and immediately, catastrophically, assumed the worst. An empty bed, a goodbye note. What else was she supposed to think? They spent the next several minutes in what Tiffany described as full-blown panic. My mother sobbing, my father trying and failing to flag down hospital staff, both of them convinced, for those minutes, that I had died and that somehow no one had called them, before a nurse finally found them and explained, with what I imagine was a very carefully controlled tone, that Amanda Whitfield had in fact survived, had been stabilized, and had been transferred 8 days ago to a rehabilitation facility, information that had absolutely been available to them the entire time, had they called, had they visited, had they simply asked. I want to sit with this moment for a second, because I think it's the hinge the entire rest of this story swings on. For one brief, gutting stretch of minutes, my parents believed they had lost me, and believed it was final, and believed there was no more time, no more chances, nothing left to do but grieve. And in that moment, not before, not during the 8 days I was actually fighting for my life, in that moment, something in them broke open. But here's the thing I need you to understand, and it's the thing that took me the longest to accept, even with everything that came after. The fact that they finally felt something did not undo what they had failed to do. Grief over a mistaken death is not the same as love shown up on time. And I say that not to be cruel, but because it's the exact distinction that would end up deciding everything in a courtroom 8 months later, and I need you to understand it now, the way I eventually had to understand it too. They drove to Ridgeview that same afternoon. I remember the moment my mother walked into my room with a clarity that still, honestly, makes my chest tight. I was sitting up in bed, working through a set of hand exercises with the resistance band a physical therapist had given me. And I looked up, and there she was, and behind her my father, and behind him Tiffany, whose face was already wrecked with crying. My mother's first words to me, after 8 days, after everything, were, "Oh my God, oh thank God, we thought we found the note. We thought—" And she couldn't finish the sentence. She just came at me and wrapped her arms around me so tightly it hurt my still healing ribs. And I sat there, stiff, not hugging her back, not yet able to process what I was even supposed to feel. I want to be honest with you about something, because I think it's important, and because I've thought about it a lot since. In that exact moment, some small, exhausted part of me wanted so badly to just let it go. To just accept the hug, accept the tears. Let this become the story where the scary accident brought the family back together and everyone learned a lesson and we all cried and moved forward. I think that part of me will always exist, honestly. I don't think it ever fully goes away, the wanting. But then my father, over my mother's shoulder, said something that I will never, as long as I live, be able to unhear. He said, "Thank God you're okay. We were so worried. This whole week with Tiffany's wedding stress has just been insane. We barely knew which way was up." He said that. In that exact moment, with his other daughter's ribs still healing under a hospital gown, he brought up the wedding stress. I didn't say anything right away. I let my mother finish hugging me. I let my father squeeze my shoulder. I even let Tiffany, sobbing, apologize to me for something that genuinely wasn't her fault, because she hadn't known, because they'd lied to her too, in their own way, by minimizing what had happened to keep the household calm around her fragile nervous system. But something in me had gone very, very quiet and very, very clear. I asked them, once everyone had settled into the plastic chairs by my bed, a simple question. I asked, "Did Dr. Reyes call you? The night they thought I might not make it?" There was a silence that told me everything before anyone said a word. My mother started to answer, something about how it was such a hard call, how Tiffany had been inconsolable that same night, how they didn't know what to do, how they were going to come as soon as things settled, and I just watched her talk, watched the sentences pile up on top of each other, each one trying to explain away the same unforgivable fact. And I understood, with total clarity, for the first time in 26 years, that my parents were never going to see me the way I needed to be seen. That there was a ceiling on how much I would ever matter in that house. And I had just spent 8 days unconscious finding out exactly where it was. I said, very calmly, "Because I think shock does that to you. It makes you calm before it lets you feel anything else. I need you both to leave. I need some time." My mother cried harder. My father looked wounded, actually wounded, like I was the one who'd done something unreasonable. Tiffany hovered near the door, not sure whose side to be on, which honestly I understood, because she'd spent her whole life being told there weren't sides. There was just her needs and everyone orbiting them. They left. And that was the beginning of what I now think of as the real story, not the accident, not the coma, but everything that came after, because that's where the truth actually got tested. I spent 6 weeks total at Ridgeview. Marcus visited every single day that his schedule allowed, and on the days it didn't, he called. He brought me terrible hospital cafeteria coffee because he knew I liked complaining about it more than I actually wanted good coffee. He sat through hours of me relearning how to walk without my hips screaming, and he never once made me feel like a burden, which is a thing I didn't fully understand I'd needed my entire life until someone finally gave it to me. My parents called during those 6 weeks. Not often. Tiffany called more, awkwardly, clearly guilty. Clearly trying to figure out how to be a sister to someone she'd never really had to be a sister to, because there'd never been room. I didn't shut her out completely. I want to be clear about that, because I know it might be tempting to make her the villain here too. And I don't think that's fair. And I don't think it's true. Tiffany was 23 years old and had spent her entire life being taught, by 2 adults who should have known better, that her needs were the only ones that counted. That's not a moral failing you choose at 12. That's a moral failing that gets built into you, brick by people who were supposed to build you into something better. My parents, though. I let go quiet for a while because I genuinely did not know what to say to them, and because every time my mother called, the conversation would inevitably drift toward some version of, "We feel so terrible, we've learned so much, we just want to move forward," and I kept waiting for the part where they actually reckoned with what they'd done, instead of just wanting to skip to the part where they felt better about it. Here's where the story takes a turn that I did not see coming, and that changed the entire shape of what happened next. About 5 weeks into my stay at Ridgeview, a case coordinator named Diane, a woman in her early 50s with the kind of unshakable, no-nonsense warmth that made her extremely good at her job, came into my room holding a folder, and a look on her face that I'd come to recognize meant something administrative and mildly unpleasant was about to happen. She sat down and told me that during a routine review of my file insurance paperwork, next of kin documentation, the usual bureaucratic scaffolding that surrounds a long hospital stay, Ridgeview's billing and records department had flagged something unusual. My father had contacted the hospital's finance office, not once but twice, during the second week of my stay, asking about what Diane described as asset and account access protocols for patients in extended care, and specifically asking whether, given my uncertain prognosis, a phrase Diane told me that my father had used, weeks after I was already stable and out of critical danger, there was a process by which a parent could be granted temporary financial power of attorney over an adult child's accounts. I remember Diane watching my face very carefully as she told me this, the way you watch someone's face when you're about to say something you know is going to land like a blow. I asked her to repeat it, because some part of me genuinely thought I'd misheard. She hadn't misspoken. My father had called my bank twice during a period when I was recovering and stable and absolutely capable, medically, of managing my own affairs, and had inquired about accessing my checking account, my small retirement fund from work, and this is the detail that still makes my stomach turn even now, my life insurance policy, a modest one I'd taken out through my job, listing at the time my parents as beneficiaries, because I'd set it up when I was 22 and had simply never gotten around to updating it. He'd been told both times that without a power of attorney document or a court-appointed guardianship, the bank could not release any information or grant access, because I was a competent adult, conscious and capable of managing my own affairs, which, again, I was, the entire time he was making these calls. I asked Diane why he would have been doing this. I already knew the answer. I think some wounded, still hopeful part of me just needed to hear someone else say it out loud, because I couldn't quite make myself say it first. Diane, to her enormous credit, didn't soften it. She said, gently but plainly, "Amanda, I think your father was trying to find out what would happen to your finances if you didn't make it. I think he wanted to be prepared, or in control, or both. And I think he was doing it while you were still in a position where he genuinely didn't know which way things would go." I did not cry, which surprised me. I think I'd already cried the amount my body had available to cry over my parents, back in that first week, quietly, at night, when Marcus thought I was asleep. What I felt instead was something colder and clearer, something that I recognize now as the actual beginning of my spine growing back. I asked Diane for copies of everything, the call logs, the internal notes, anything documented. She told me, with a small, approving nod that I didn't fully appreciate until much later, that she'd already anticipated I might want that, and that she'd take the appropriate steps to have it formally requested through records, the correct legal way, so that nothing I eventually did with that information could ever be challenged as improperly obtained. I want to pause here and tell you something about Diane, because she is, alongside Marcus, one of the two people who make this story bearable to tell. One of the two people who remind me, even now, that the world is not only made of people like my parents. Diane didn't have to flag that phone call. She could have let it slide into the general noise of hospital paperwork, the way 99% of administrative oddities do. She chose to notice it, and she chose to tell me, a groggy, still recovering 26-year-old, the truth, clearly, without hedging, because she believed I deserved to know what had actually happened to me while I couldn't defend myself. I was discharged from Ridgeview in early May, almost 2 months after the accident, walking with a cane, my pelvis still not fully healed, my brain still occasionally betraying me with headaches and word-finding trouble that my doctors assured me would improve with time. I moved in temporarily with Marcus strictly as friends. I want to stress at that point, though I think we both privately suspected, and even then, that something else was quietly taking root because my apartment had stairs I couldn't manage yet, and because, frankly, he was the only person in my life I trusted enough to be that vulnerable in front of. My parents wanted to see me. They called constantly during that first week home. My mother sent flowers, which I found, in the moment, almost darkly funny, because flowers were the exact wrong currency for what had happened, but I don't think she knew any other currency to spend in. I agreed to meet them, about 10 days after I got out, at a coffee shop, neutral ground. My choice. I brought Marcus, not because I needed a bodyguard, but because I needed someone in the room who I trusted to remember what actually happened if my memory of the conversation later got rewritten by everyone's competing feelings, which in my family was historically exactly what happened to hard conversations. They got softened in the retelling until nobody could quite agree on what was originally said. My parents arrived looking older than I remembered, which I think grief and guilt can genuinely do to a person's face over just a couple of months. My mother started crying almost immediately. My father sat very stiffly, the way he does when he's uncomfortable and trying to project competence anyway. I told them calmly that I knew about the calls to the bank. I watched my father's face do something I will never forget. Not shock. I want to be precise about this, because it matters not shock, but something closer to being caught. A flicker of calculation before the excuse arrived, and I recognized that flicker because I'd seen it on Tiffany's face 100 times growing up, right before she talked her way out of something. I'd just never seen it on my father's face directed at me. He said it was just being practical. He said that with my prognosis so uncertain, someone needed to make sure things didn't fall through the cracks, that he was trying to protect the family. That if something had happened to me, someone would have needed to handle things. And wasn't it better that he'd been thinking ahead? I asked him very simply, "Handle what things, Dad?" I was alive. I was going to wake up. Doctors told you that. You were trying to get into my bank account while I was in a coma, a week before you even bothered to visit me. My mother reached for my hand across the table. I let her take it, but I didn't hold it back. She said, "We were scared, Amanda. We didn't know what to do. We've never been good in a crisis, you know that. We've always struggled. And with Tiffany needing—" I stopped her there. I said, and I remember the words exactly because I'd been rehearsing some version of this sentence in my head for weeks without realizing it. Tiffany didn't need anything that week except for you to tell her the truth. You lied to her too. You lied to everyone so you could keep doing what you've always done, which is make everything about managing Tiffany's feelings, even my accident. Even that. My father got defensive then, the way men like my father do when a truth gets too close to something they've built their identity around. He said I was being unfair, that I didn't understand the pressure they were under, that Tiffany's mental health was a real and serious thing, and I was acting like it wasn't. And this is the part I want you to really hear. because it's the part that took me 26 years to be able to say out loud. Sitting in that coffee shop with Marcus's hand resting quietly on the table near mine, not touching, just there. Steady, I said. I never once said Tiffany's anxiety isn't real. I have never said that in my entire life. What I'm saying is that my life mattered too. What I'm saying is that I almost died, and you found out I might not make it, and you chose a scheduling argument about a wedding date over coming to say goodbye to me. There is no version of being bad in a crisis that explains that. That's not panic. That's a choice you made over and over, for 8 days. Nobody said anything for a long moment. My mother was crying harder now, quietly, into a napkin. My father's jaw was tight. And then I told them the thing I'd decided, alone, in the weeks before that meeting, lying awake in Marcus's guest room with my hip aching, staring at the ceiling, working through what I actually wanted, not out of anger, but out of something calmer and more permanent than anger. I told them I was removing them as beneficiaries on my life insurance policy. I told them I was formally naming Marcus as my medical power of attorney, on record, updated, notarized, so that what happened during those 8 days could never happen again. To me or to anyone who loved me the way he had. And I told them that I needed space, real space. Not a metaphor, not a cooling off period before things went back to normal, because I had just learned in the most painful way a person can learn something, exactly how much I mattered to them. And I needed time to figure out what my life looked like now that I knew. My father, and I want you to really sit with the audacity of this, because even now, telling you this part, I feel that old familiar disbelief creeping back in my father said, "You're really going to punish us over paperwork?" "We made a mistake, Amanda. People make mistakes. Are you going to hold this over our heads forever?" Paperwork. He called it paperwork. I stood up. I remember my hip protesting. I remember Marcus's hand coming up instinctively to help steady me, and I remember looking down at both of my parents, my mother's mascara running, my father's face rigid with the particular anger of a person who has just realized the story he's been telling himself about himself might not survive contact with the truth. And I said, "It's not paperwork. It's the only language you two ever actually speak. So I'm speaking it back to you." And I left. I want to tell you that this is where the story ends, with a clean, satisfying exit. But real life is messier than that, and this is where things actually escalated in a way I genuinely did not see coming. 6 months went by. I healed slowly, the way bodies do. The cane became a limp. The limp became a slight stiffness in cold weather that my doctor said might just be permanent, a souvenir. My headaches faded. Marcus and I, somewhere in that stretch of time, without either of us really deciding it on purpose, stopped being just friends. And I remember the moment it shifted with a clarity I don't have for almost anything else from that year we were on his couch, some forgettable movie playing, and he looked over at me and said, "I need you to know that I would do all of it again. Every single day of it. I need you to know that." And I said, "I know." And he said, "No, I don't think you do. Not all the way. And I need you to." And that was it. That was the whole conversation. It didn't need to be more than that. I went back to work part-time in the fall, then full-time by winter, back with my kids, back with Mason, who was walking without a limp by then, and who told me, with the brutal honesty only a 7-year-old possesses, that I walked kind of funny now too, which, honestly, felt like the most normal, healing conversation I'd had in months. Tiffany and I found something that resembled a real relationship for the first time in our lives during that stretch. She came to see me on her own, without our parents, more than once. She apologized genuinely, tearfully, specifically. Not the vague, "I'm sorry you feel that way" apologies our parents specialized in, but real ones, where she named the actual things she was sorry for. She told me she'd spent years assuming I was fine, because I never said otherwise, and that she was starting to understand, slowly, painfully, that my fine had never actually been fine. It had just been quiet. She postponed her wedding actually, not because of any drama, but because she said she needed time to figure out who I am when I'm not the family emergency. Which I thought, and still think, was one of the most genuinely self-aware things I'd ever heard come out of her mouth. My parents, though. My parents took a different path entirely. And it's the path that turns this from a sad family story into the story I'm actually here to tell you, the one with the courtroom in it. About 7 months after the accident, I received a letter from an attorney I'd never heard of, representing my parents, informing me that they intended to challenge the validity of the updated medical power of attorney and healthcare proxy documents I'd filed naming Marcus, on the grounds that I had, and I'm quoting the letter almost exactly because I've read it so many times the language is burned into me, executed said documents while in a compromised cognitive state following a traumatic brain injury, raising serious questions about Ms. Whitfield's competency and decision-making capacity at the time of signing, and further raising concerns about undue influence exerted by a non-family individual during a period of vulnerability. They were suing me, or more precisely, they were attempting to have my legal decisions about my own body and my own life overturned in court, on the theory that I hadn't been in my right mind when I made them, and that Marcus, the man who'd slept in a hospital chair for 4 nights while they were at home managing a wedding date argument, had somehow manipulated a brain-injured woman into cutting out her own parents. I remember reading that letter standing in my kitchen, Marcus at work, completely alone, and I remember laughing. Not a happy laugh. The kind of laugh that comes out of you when something is so absurd, so brazen, that your body doesn't know what else to do with it. And then I remember calling an attorney of my own. Her name was Nicole Hastings, and she'd been recommended to me by Diane. Of all people, Diane, the case coordinator from Ridgeview, who I'd stayed loosely in touch with, and who, when I called her in a panic to tell her what my parents were doing, said without missing a beat, "I know exactly who you need to call," and gave me Nicole's number. Nicole was 34, sharp, unflappable, the kind of lawyer who listens to your entire story without interrupting once, and then, when you're done, asks exactly 3 questions that reveal she understood the whole thing better than you did while you were living it. I told her everything. The accident, the calls to my bank, the 8 days, the note, Dr. Reyes, Marcus, all of it. She took notes the entire time, and near the end, she set down her pen and said, "Amanda, I want to be honest with you. What your parents are trying to do here is not going to work. But they can make it expensive and exhausting to prove that, so I need you to be ready for that. And I need you to trust me completely when I tell you we are going to win this decisively." I signed with her that day. Here is where I need to walk you through what actually happened over the following 4 months, because this is the part of the story that I think people find the most satisfying, and I understand why, because I lived it and it was, despite everything it cost me, deeply, viscerally satisfying to watch unfold. My parents' attorney, a man named Kevin Marsh who had a reputation, Nicole told me, for taking cases other lawyers wouldn't touch because he liked a fight more than he liked being right, filed a petition for a competency hearing, arguing that my medical decisions post-accident should be reviewed by the court and potentially reversed. And this is the part that still makes my jaw tighten even now, arguing simultaneously that my parents should be granted standing to review and potentially contest the beneficiary changes on my life insurance policy, on the theory that as my closest living relatives, they had an inherent interest in ensuring I hadn't been financially exploited during a vulnerable period. Let me say that again, slower, because I need you to really hear it the way I had to hear it. My parents, the same people who tried to access my bank accounts while I was in a coma, were now arguing in a legal filing that I needed to be protected from financial exploitation, and that Marcus, the man who'd held my hand through the worst 8 days of my life, was the exploiter. Nicole built our case with a precision I will be grateful for as long as I live. She subpoenaed the hospital records from Mercy General, all of them the call logs from Nurse Patricia's initial contact with my parents, the time-stamped notes from Dr. Reyes's second call warning them that I might not survive the night, my mother's exact recorded response about Tiffany needing them more, the discharge and transfer paperwork showing exactly when I moved to Ridgeview, and every single scrap of documentation from Ridgeview's finance office about my father's 2 calls attempting to access my accounts. She deposed my parents separately, which I wasn't present for, but which Nicole later described to me in enough detail that I could practically see it. She deposed my mother first, and my mother under oath, When asked directly why she hadn't come to the hospital after being told her daughter might not survive the night, said something Nicole told me she almost couldn't believe was said out loud, on the record, in front of a court reporter. I have 2 daughters, and I had to make a choice about who needed me more in that moment. Tiffany's needs have always been more immediate. More immediate. My mother compared the immediacy of her daughter's wedding date anxiety to her other daughter's life-threatening brain injury, under oath, and called the wedding more urgent. Nicole told me that when she read that answer back, slowly, and then asked my mother if she'd like to clarify or rephrase her statement, my mother simply sat there and eventually said quietly, "I don't know how to answer that differently. It's the truth. It's the truth." My mother, under oath, in a formal deposition, with an attorney and a court reporter and God as her witness, admitted the exact thing I had spent my entire life half suspecting and desperately hoping wasn't real. My father's deposition, when it came to the bank calls, went almost as badly for him. Nicole walked him through the phone records, the exact dates, the exact language he'd used with the bank representatives. Uncertain prognosis. A phrase he'd apparently borrowed from a television medical drama, because when Nicole asked him where he'd heard that specific term, he genuinely couldn't answer, and asked him plainly why he had contacted my bank about account access before he had contacted the hospital about my actual condition. He tried the same explanation he'd given me in that coffee shop, the practical, protecting the family language, and Nicole, by her own account, let him talk for a full 2 minutes without interrupting, let him build the entire structure of his justification, and then asked one question that, she told me, she watched physically deflate him in real time. "Mr. Whitfield, if you were simply being practical and thinking ahead, why didn't you also call your daughter's employer to ask about her sick leave, or her landlord about her rent? Both of which would have been equally practical concerns for a family member in the hospital. And yet you called only her bank, twice, specifically asking about account access. Can you explain that distinction?" He could not. The competency hearing itself took place in early autumn, almost exactly 8 months after the accident, in a courtroom that felt far too ordinary, far too beige and fluorescent lit, for the size of what was actually happening inside it. I want to tell you about that room, because I remember every detail of it with a strange, hyper-focused clarity. The way the light caught the water pitcher on the table in front of me. The sound of the judge's chair creaking every time she shifted. The fact that my hands were completely steady, which surprised me because I'd expected to be shaking. Judge Patricia Nguyen, no relation to the nurse, a coincidence I noticed and privately found almost darkly funny, given how many people named Patricia had ended up mattering in this story, presided, and I remember her expression staying carefully neutral through most of the proceedings. The practiced neutrality of someone who has heard 1,000 families tear each other apart in this exact room and has learned not to let her face give anything away too early. Kevin Marsh, my parents' attorney, made his opening argument with real confidence, and I'll give him this much: he was a skilled lawyer, and he made the case sound almost reasonable if you didn't know the underlying facts. A young woman, recently emerged from a medically induced coma, still recovering from a traumatic brain injury, executing major legal documents naming a non-family romantic partner as her primary decision-maker within weeks of regaining consciousness. Documents that happened to remove her biological parents from every position of authority or financial benefit they'd previously held in her life. Said out loud, in a courtroom, stripped of context, I understood, watching the judge's face, why it might sound alarming to someone hearing it cold. Then Dr. Sandra Reyes testified. I want to tell you about Dr. Reyes on that stand, because I think about it often, because I think it was the moment the entire case actually turned. She was calm, precise, utterly unshakable under Kevin Marsh's cross-examination. And when he tried to suggest that my cognitive state at the time of signing the updated power of attorney documents, which had actually been executed nearly 6 weeks after the accident, at Ridgeview, not in the immediate aftermath he was implying might have been compromised, Dr. Reyes simply pulled out my actual cognitive assessment scores from that period, documented, time-stamped, unambiguous, and stated plainly that I had been assessed as fully oriented, fully competent, and fully capable of complex decision-making at the time those documents were signed, and that in fact, she said, turning slightly to address the judge directly. Ms. Whitfield's decision-making throughout her recovery was, in my professional opinion, notably clear-headed and deliberate, particularly given the circumstances she was navigating. Nicole then called Nurse Patricia, who read in a steady, controlled voice the exact transcript of her first call to my mother, the one where my mother said she was a little busy, and asked if there was someone else the hospital could call. I watched my mother's face while that was read aloud in open court. I watched her not be able to look at anyone. Then Nicole called Diane, who walked the court through the bank inquiry timeline with the same clear, unhesitating professionalism she'd shown me in my hospital room months earlier, laying out, date by date, exactly when my father had called, exactly what he'd asked, and exactly how far into my recovery. Nearly 2 full weeks after the accident, well after doctors had confirmed I was stable and expected to survive, those calls had taken place. And then Nicole called Marcus. I hadn't wanted him to testify, honestly, not because I doubted him, but because I knew what it would cost him to sit up there and have Kevin Marsh try to paint him as some kind of predator who'd taken advantage of a vulnerable woman. And I hated the idea of him having to defend the fact that he'd loved me out loud to a room full of strangers, as though love needed defending. But Marcus, when I told him this the night before, just looked at me and said, "Amanda, I would stand up in front of every courtroom in this country and tell them exactly what I did and why, as many times as it takes. Let me do this. Please." He testified for almost 40 minutes. He described, without embellishment, without performance, simply and plainly, the 8 days. The vacation days he'd used, the nights in the chair, the conversations with doctors, the moment I woke up and asked where my parents were, and the lie he told me to protect me from a truth I wasn't strong enough yet to hear. Kevin Marsh, on cross-examination, tried to suggest that Marcus's devotion during those 8 days was itself evidence of an agenda, a long game, a calculated investment in a vulnerable woman's eventual gratitude and inheritance. He asked, with what I can only describe as a truly breathtaking lack of self-awareness, whether Marcus had perhaps seen an opportunity in my parents' absence. Marcus didn't get angry. I remember that distinctly, because I was braced for him to get angry, and instead he just looked at Kevin Marsh and then at the judge and said quietly, "I saw a woman I cared about who was going to die alone if somebody didn't show up. I didn't think about opportunity. I thought about the fact that nobody else was coming, and that felt wrong, and I wasn't going to let it happen without at least one person in that room who actually wanted to be there." I watched Judge Nguyen's pen stop moving. I watched her look up from her notes for the first time all afternoon. The ruling came down 2 weeks later, and it was not close. Judge Nguyen found that I had been fully competent at the time I executed my medical power of attorney and beneficiary changes, found no evidence whatsoever of undue influence, and in language that Nicole later told me was unusually pointed for a written judicial opinion, noted that the court found it, quote, "deeply troubling that the petitioners, having demonstrably failed to respond to their daughter's medical emergency, despite direct and repeated notification of its severity, now seek to characterize as vulnerable and exploitable the very same decisions their daughter made independently, clearly, and rationally in the extended aftermath of that emergency. Decisions which happen to reflect an accurate and reasonable assessment of who, in fact, showed up for her when it mattered." She dismissed the petition in its entirety, ordered my parents to cover a substantial portion of my legal fees given what she characterized as the petition's lack of good faith basis. And this is the detail I still think about most, the one that felt less like a legal ruling and more like the universe. Finally saying the quiet part out loud, she looked directly at my parents from the bench, before adjourning, and said, "I don't often editorialize from this seat, but I'll say this. Your daughter is alive today in large part because of the people who chose to show up for her. The court would encourage you to sit with that fact, rather than continue to litigate against it." I did not cry in that courtroom. I want you to know that because I think it matters. I had cried enough privately over the previous 8 months that by the time I was sitting there hearing those words, what I felt instead was something quieter and steadier, something that felt less like triumph and more like finally exhaling. I want to tell you what happened after because I think the after is actually the part that makes this story worth telling. More than the courtroom, more than the ruling, because anyone can tell you a story about winning. Fewer people can tell you honestly what winning actually feels like, and what it doesn't fix. My father did not apologize that day, or that week, or that month. My father, as far as I know, has still never said the words, "I'm sorry" to me directly. Not really, not without immediately wrapping them in some justification about stress or fear or practicality. What he did do, about 4 months after the ruling, was show up unannounced at the rehab center where I work, ask to speak to me during my lunch break, and, standing awkwardly in the parking lot, tell me that he'd been seeing a therapist, that he'd started going after the hearing because, in his words, hearing it read out loud in a courtroom made it real in a way it hadn't been before. And that he wasn't asking me to forgive him. He just wanted me to know he was trying to understand why he'd made the choices he made. It wasn't an apology, not exactly. But it was something, and I've learned to let some things be something without demanding they be everything. My mother's process looked different, and honestly, more honest in its own way. About 6 weeks after the ruling, she wrote me a letter. A real one. Handwritten, several pages. And in it, she didn't try to explain herself the way she had in the deposition. She wrote about her own childhood, about growing up as the invisible middle child of 5, about how she'd promised herself that if she ever had kids, none of them would ever feel invisible the way she had, and how, somewhere along the way, in trying to make sure Tiffany never felt what she'd felt, she'd made me feel it instead, and hadn't even noticed she was doing it until a judge said it out loud in a courtroom with my father's silence next to her. She wrote, near the end of the letter, a line I've thought about more times than I can count since. I spent so long trying to make sure one daughter never felt unseen that I made the other one invisible instead. And I don't know how to undo that. I only know I finally see it. And I am so sorry that seeing it took almost losing you. I haven't fully reconciled with my mother, but I write her back now sometimes. We talk carefully, on the phone, once every few weeks. It's not what it should have been all along, but it's real. In a way nothing between us ever was before the accident. And I've decided that real, even late, even imperfect, is worth something. Tiffany's wedding happened the following June, a full year after the original date she and Brandon had fought about, the fight that had apparently been more important than my life for one very long week. I was her maid of honor. I gave a toast, and in it, without going into the details, I said that the past year had taught me more about who actually shows up for you than anything else in my life ever had, and that I was grateful, genuinely grateful, to be standing there with my sister, because somewhere in the wreckage of that year, we'd finally, for the first time, actually found each other. Tiffany cried through the whole toast. So did I, honestly. Marcus and I got married 18 months after the accident, in a small ceremony in his sister's backyard. Nothing fancy, string lights that reminded me, in a way I chose to find healing rather than haunting, of the ones at Tiffany's engagement party the night everything changed. Dr. Reyes came. Diane came and cried harder than almost anyone else there, which surprised me and which I will never forget. Nurse Patricia sent a card. Nicole sent a bottle of very good champagne with a note that said, "You already won the important case. This one's just for love." My parents were there too, sitting quietly in the second row, and my father shook Marcus's hand at the reception and said, "Thank you for taking care of my daughter when I didn't," which was the closest thing to a full apology I think he'll ever be capable of giving. And I've decided that's allowed to be enough, because I stopped needing it to be more than that a long time ago. I still work at the rehab center. I still sit on the floor with kids who can't grip a spoon yet, and I still feel that same fierce, quiet joy every time one of them finally can. My hip still aches when it rains, a permanent reminder of the night everything in my life split cleanly into before and after. I've made peace with the ache. I've made peace, mostly, with the year that caused it. And every once in a while, usually late at night, when Marcus is already asleep beside me and the house is quiet in that specific way that makes your mind wander back to places it usually keeps us carefully shut, I think about that note. The one I wrote with shaking hands on a hospital tray table. The one my parents found instead of me. The one that read, in its entirety, I waited. I don't think anyone's coming. I think about the fact that I wrote it believing it might be the last thing I ever left behind in this world. And I think about the fact that instead, it became the first true thing anyone in my family had said out loud in 26 years, and that it took an empty hospital bed and a piece of paper to finally make them listen. I don't wish the accident on anyone. I wouldn't wish that pain, that fear, that 8 days on my worst enemy. But I will tell you this, and I mean it with everything I have. If that was the price of finally knowing, with total certainty, exactly who would show up for me when it mattered most, my sister, eventually, imperfectly, but genuinely, my mother, late, but honestly, and Marcus, who never once needed a courtroom to tell him what love actually looked like, then I would pay it again. Not because it didn't cost me everything, but because on the other side of it, for the first time in my entire life, I finally know exactly where I stand, and exactly who is standing there with me. And that, it turns out, was worth more than anything my parents could have ever put in a bank account.